Hi everyone, it's Tony Costa from Toronto Apologetics, and I just want to welcome you here. We are in, is it Brookfield?
West Brookfield.
West Brookfield, Massachusetts, and we are at the hill. It's called
Foster Hill.
Foster Hill, and what you see behind me here is the famous rock from which George Whitefield preached here to the people who had come into the fields, and he preached here on October the 16th, 740. I'm joined here by Pastor Gary George from Sovereign Grace Chapel here in which city is it, Pastor?
Southbridge, Massachusetts.
Southbridge, Massachusetts. And so Pastor Gary is studied in this area of George Whitefield. So Pastor Gary, tell us a little bit about George Whitefield, where he was from. We know he was from England, but can you tell us why he came here to Massachusetts and preached?
Well, George Whitefield came from Gloucester, England. That's where he was born. And as a young child, his parents owned an inn called the Bell's Inn. And they believed that George Whitefield, because there were so many actors and the theater was very big back in those days in that town of Gloucester, that George Whitefield himself loved theatrics. And it's believed that he learned a lot about theatrics, and that's why he became eventually such a dynamic, animated preacher. Well, anyway, he got saved around the age of 20 or 21. He gave his first sermon around that time as well. They said that his sermon, when it was delivered, it was so powerful that it actually drove 15 people crazy. And he continued in his ministry. He was ordained first as a deacon, then as a priest in the Church of England. And then on one occasion in 1737, I believe it was, is when he was out in a place called Kingswood, where the miners would come out from their mining, and George Whitefield saw them all right there, and he ended up preaching the gospel in the open air. This was considered very radical in those days, because to be preaching outside of the church was almost heretical as far as the Church of England was concerned. So he was, from that point on, he was almost a renegade in some ways. But his preaching was so effective, and he was so moved to preach the gospel, that he began to start preaching open air. He got hooked up with the Wesleys, and they came to America on his first trip, I believe, where he got acquainted with the ministry of the Wesleys that had to do with the orphans in Savannah, Georgia. Whitefield himself returned back, and then he had a burden for the America itself, the East Coast, and he was up and down the East Coast, and he came up, of course, to Philadelphia, and he met Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a producer of a newspaper. Newspapers were new back in those days. So the way in which Whitefield's journeys would be tallied and his travels would be marked would be by the fact that he would, with consent and collaboration with Benjamin Franklin, it would be publicized. So his travels were in advance known, plus he had people that would go before him like a forerunner and say that George Whitefield is coming. And that's what happened right here in this particular town of West Brookfield in 1740. He had a man named Seward, I believe was his last name, who would come in advance and say that Reverend Whitefield is coming to your town. Well, a lot of the towns, like this town and many more, didn't have churches large enough to be able to host such a big audience as George Whitefield would draw. That was one reason why he had to go outside. Plus, he was looked at again as a Calvinistic, sort of a heretic. They were skeptical about him from that standpoint as well. And he loved to preach the gospel. And here we are, Tony, if you could show...
You want to show the field?
The field here, where somewhere around 500 people would have been gathered here to hear George Whitefield preach. There's a church down the street called the George Whitefield Methodist Church. We're not sure about the actual connection with George Whitefield specifically, even though George Whitefield was sort of a forerunner of the Methodist denomination.
Right, right. And so his influence on Benjamin Franklin, I'm sure this trickled down to the other founding fathers as well. You had mentioned that George Washington had written about him.
Yes.
So can you say a little bit more about that regarding the other fathers?
Well, Patrick Henry did, William Wilberforce, heard him at the age of 10 years of age. Benjamin Franklin was so infatuated with Whitefield's oratory abilities that he became very well acquainted. They became friends in a way, although Benjamin Franklin himself denied the deity of Christ and the inspiration of the scriptures. So there obviously wasn't going to be fellowship in that way. But nevertheless, they became friends. Whitefield stayed in Benjamin Franklin's home. George Whitefield became so well known that they said that he could have been and very well was the most popular man in the world back in those days. And so here he comes to New England. He obviously hooks up with Jonathan Edwards, who's not too far from here. This pathway that we're on was known as the King's Way, and this was the route from Northfield, Northampton rather, where Jonathan Edwards was. And we think that he was coming from Edwards' place to head to Boston, and he came in this direction, heading to the east side of the state of Massachusetts. And he went on to Boston. But here is one of the places that he stopped, and he preached the gospel to about 500 people in this field, which would be a large population for a small rural town outside of the city of Worcester.
And we're looking at 500 people came to hear him here at this spot?
Exactly. Where we're standing here, and this rock behind me is where Whitefield stood on this rock. Whitefield would use anything that he could do to elevate himself. He would get on scaffolds, he would stand on hills, he would preach from open windows, anything that he could be elevated. He actually brought a pulpit, a mobile pulpit of his own that he would set up so that he could be a little elevated above the audience and preach. Right. They would throw rotten eggs at him, body parts of cats and feces and tomatoes. He was brutally handled many times. They would even hire drummers to try to drum out his preaching. He was not well received, of course, from the enemy. They were always out there trying to badger him and to try to hinder the presentation of the gospel. On one occasion, he got stoned and he got hit in the head, and he bore a mark on his skull for his lifetime. Because of that, he had been beaten by clubs, and many times he was mauled and treated just like a criminal almost.
And where did George Whitefield pass away? Was it here in New England that he passed?
Right here. Well, he died in Newburyport, Massachusetts, which is in north of Boston. He had actually gone to Exeter, New Hampshire, to present his last, I should say, open air preaching. They said that he was more fit to go to bed than to be preaching the gospel outdoors. They ended up bringing him back to Newburyport, where he was housed in a parsonage next to the Presbyterian Church. And that night he struggled breathing. He had a breathing problem for months in advance of that. And Whitefield had said, "I would rather burn out than rust out." And it's said that when Whitefield was in the home, people in that area of Newburyport knew that he was in the area, and they had found out where he was staying. And as he had come downstairs, this is his very last night on earth, he came downstairs to get hot milk for himself, and he started to elevate the steps, and there was poundings on the door. People were shouting, "We want Whitefield, we want Whitefield." And George Whitefield looked at his host and said, "Open the door." And on that stairway, George Whitefield preached the gospel, and he actually had a candle in his hand on a dish, and they said that he preached fervently on the steps halfway up the stairway until that candle burned right down to the bottom. He went upstairs and he ended up dying at 6 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah. And where is he buried here in New England?
So right next door to where he actually died, there was a Presbyterian church. I think it's called the South Newburyport Presbyterian Church. You could look that up. And his body is actually underneath the pulpit even today. And it had been on display for a long time. And then when somebody from England came and tried to steal from the coffin his bones, ended up stealing his wrist. And they never got the wrist bone back. The person wanted to bring it back to England, where they thought that George Whitefield's remains should be, because he was from England. And it turned out the only thing that they could get was the wrist bone box that the person had stolen it and put it in. But yes, his body to this day remains. I've been there several different times, and it's right underneath the pulpit.
Yeah, so all those who are into open air preaching, George Whitefield, in many respects, was the father of open air preaching. And so here we have this, God told Joshua to set up the stone in Shechem as a memorial to his covenant with his people. And so here we have this stone that stands still as a witness, a memorial to one of God's greatest servants that he sent here to the United States. So Pastor Gary, if people are in the Massachusetts area and they're looking for a good solid church, I just preached at Pastor Gary's church this morning, a solid biblical church. Where can they find you? Is there a website for the church? And is there a YouTube channel that they can go to?
Yes, well, go to sovereigngracema.org. Sovereign Grace, all one word, ma.org. And by the way, I happen to do open air preaching myself. I started on the Worcester Common, a place where George Whitefield preached way back when, and I continue to do Worcester open air preaching twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays. And George Whitefield had won my heart way back when I was first converted in 1975. He's my patron saint, so to speak, and I wish I had a powerful lion-like voice like he did, in such a grasp of Scripture. They said that he was so animated that people sometimes felt as if they were in hell in fire, because he was so fervent and so passionate. He preached with such passion that he was known as the weeping preacher. He wept when he preached. He was totally absorbed in the gospel, in a love for the souls, so much so that he says, since you don't weep for yourselves, I will be weeping for you. And that indeed is what he did do.
And oh, that God would raise up more preachers like George Whitefield. Thank you so much, Pastor Gary. I appreciate that.
Good to be with you, Brother Tony.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.